The hard cold had been on England for 19 days when Miss Marple stepped down from the 4:15 at Burford Halt.
You
And the
knew
first
this
thing
day
she
would
noticed, before her cousin
I
Hester,
did.
or the
Are you ready
porter
for
or
it?
the smell of coal smoke off the engine, was the sound the platform made under her shoe. It was not the sound a platform ought to make. It was a fine, dry, ringing sound, as though the stone itself had been refrigerated through to its centre, and had given up the small accommodations a stone usually makes for a foot. Welcome, she thought, drawing her coat closer, to a place that has stopped trying to be warm, before we step any further into the village with her. Dear friends, a very warm welcome to Marple Mysteries. I'm so glad you've joined me at the fireside today. Wherever in the world you are listening from, a kitchen in Ohio, a flat in Manchester, a long drive across the prairies, a quiet hour in Melbourne, do tell me in the comments below, won't you? I do so like to know where my listeners are sitting. Pour yourself something hot, settle in under a blanket, and let us walk together into little paddocks, end in the bitter January of 1931, where the pond has frozen to a depth no living villager remembers, and where a body, in 3 mornings' time, will be lifted out from beneath the ice. Stay with me to the end. The truth of this one is older than anyone in the village is prepared to admit. Hester Penrose was waiting beside the station fence in a black coat that had been good 10 winters ago and was still being asked to do its duty. She lifted one mittened hand when she saw Jane, and her face did the small private rearrangement of a recently widowed woman, remembering, briefly, what it was to be pleased about something. You came, Hester said, as though there had been any question. I said I would, dear. People say a great many things in November and forget them by January. Not about cousins. They walked. The lane out of the halt rose for half a mile between hedges that had been laid the autumn before and were now sheathed in a glittering and unbroken white. The light was going. The sky above the bare oaks was the colour of weak tea cooled in a cup, and the rooks, which ought at this hour to have been quarrelling their way home, were silent. Miss Marple, who had grown up understanding weather as a kind of slow argument the land conducted with itself, recognized the particular stillness of a cold that had stopped trying to move. There was no wind. The frost on the topmost twigs had been there, undisturbed, for days. 19 days, Hester said, following her glance. The vicar, the new one, Mr. Coodlip, you'll meet him, said yesterday that he had read of such frosts in his grandfather's diaries, but never expected to walk through one. Old Tovey says the pond hasn't gone like this since '95. And the village is indoors, which makes it, in its way, easier to know. People come to the post office only when they must, and they stay longer when they do. Mrs. Beswick must be enjoying herself. Hester gave her cousin a sidelong look, half smiling. You have not even arrived, Jane, and you are already at work. I am not at work, dear. I am visiting. I have brought you mauve wool and a great deal of patience, and the cardigan I promised your eldest grandchild, which is 2 sleeves short of finished. I do not intend to know anything about anyone. No, said Hester. Of course not. The cottage stood at the lower end of the village green, opposite the church, and a stone's throw from the vicarage proper, which Hester had vacated 3 months after Albert's death, with what she described as a relief I would prefer not to examine. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, straight column that did not bend. Inside, the parlour was warm in the small way a single-fire room can be warm. Close to the grate everything lived. 3 feet away everything was preserved. They had supper at the round table by the window, a mutton stew Hester had made the day before, bread, an apple cut in quarters. The green outside was empty. Once, while they ate, a figure crossed it. A man in a long coat, walking briskly with his head down, carrying what looked like a bound notebook under his arm. Hester set down her spoon. "That," she said, "is the Bristol man. Oh, Calthrop, his name is, took a room at the Bell 10 days ago. He has been in the parish records 3 afternoons running, and at the churchyard twice, and at the Bell every evening buying drinks for whoever will sit with him. He says he is researching a family history for a client in Canada." "And is he?" "He may be." Hester looked at the window a moment longer, until the figure was lost behind the yew at the church gate. "But I will tell you, Jane, what I do not like. I do not like a man who reads parish registers in winter. Summer is different. Summer people poke about in old graves because it is a thing to do in the long evenings. A man who comes in January, when the roads are bad, and the rooms are cold, and the registers are unheated. A man who comes then, he has a reason that will not wait." Miss Marple, who had been about to take the last quarter of her apple, set it down instead, and looked across at her cousin with quiet attention. Hester, she remembered, had always tracked not births and deaths, but movements. Who came, when, and whether the timing made sense. "And no one has asked him," Hester went on, "what the hurry is." Outside, in the failing light, the pond at the bottom of the green lay flat and black and perfectly still, holding under its 19-day skin of ice whatever the village had not yet thought to look for. Hester took herself to bed at 8:15, apologizing for it as widows do, and Miss Marple, who had no wish to sleep at such an hour, and a strong wish to see more of the village than its empty green at dusk, put on her good coat and her second-best hat, and walked the 80 yards to the Bell and Crook with her knitting bag over her arm. The parlour of the Bell was a low room with a beamed ceiling, stained the colour of strong tea by 2 centuries of pipe smoke, and on this particular evening it was fuller than it had any business being on a Monday in January. The hard frost had done what hard frost always does in an English village. It had pushed the men out of their own houses and into a room with a larger fire. Miss Marple, settling herself in a high-backed settle near the inglenook, with a small glass of sherry she did not intend to drink, took out the half-finished cardigan and her mauve wool and began to knit. She had long ago discovered that a woman knitting in a public room is a piece of furniture, and that a piece of furniture hears everything. She counted 7 men and 1 woman, not including the landlord. The woman was Mrs. Beswick from the post office, sitting in a corner with a glass of stout and an expression of professional alertness. 3 of the men were farmers. One was the landlord's brother, who was deaf. One was Reuben Tovey the sexton, very still by the fire, with his hands round a mug. One was a younger man with a sour set to his mouth, and the broad shoulders of someone who worked outdoors. Miss Marple, without having to be told, knew this was the Daniel Sparrow her cousin had mentioned in passing. And the 7th man was the Bristol man, Calthrop. He had taken the centre of the room. He stood with his back half to the fire, a glass in one hand and the other resting easy on the mantel, and he was buying. "A good man, Mr. Pollitt. Won't you take another half? Mr. Wickham, the same. Landlord, if you would." He had the manner of a person who did this often and well, not jovially, not in a way that drew attention to itself, but with the steady, patient generosity of a fisherman feeding a pool he intended to come back to. Miss Marple's needles moved. She did not look up. "Would have been the year of the bad lambing," one of the farmers was saying. 8, 9, snow into March. 1908, said Calthrop easily. "Aye, about then. A hard winter, I've been told. I had a connection of my clients, you understand, who was in service hereabouts that year. A young woman." The fire shifted. Reuben Tovey, by it, did not move, but his hand on the mug closed slightly. "In service where, sir?" said the landlord, polishing a glass with the careful neutrality of a man who has been a landlord for 30 years. "At the manor, I believe." There was a small pause in the room. It was not a silence. The deaf brother coughed. The fire spoke. But it was a pause in the social weather, the kind of pause that a knitting woman in the corner registers as clearly as a barometer registers a fall. Miss Marple counted 3 stitches before anyone spoke. "A great many young women were in service at the manor in those years," said the landlord. "Lady Constance had a full house then. Sir Hugh, God rest him, kept it up handsomely. Of course, of course. Her name was Alice Tarrant." The pause this time was longer. Reuben Tovey set his mug down on the hearthstone very carefully, as though it were full of something more precious than ale. Mrs. Beswick in her corner did not stir, but her eyes moved once, sideways, to Tovey and back. Dan Sparrow, who had not been listening, glanced up and lost interest again. "Tarrant," said the landlord, as though tasting an unfamiliar wine. "I don't recall a Tarrant. Suffolk family, I believe. The young woman would have been about 20 in 1908. A long time ago, sir. Memory plays tricks." "It does," Calthrop agreed, smiling, and turned the conversation gently into the weather. "He was." Miss Marple nodded. "Very good." He had asked his question. The question had landed where he wanted it to land. He had let it go before anyone could be required to refuse it. He had also, in that one small moment, told the room what he was. Every man at the bar now understood that Mr. Calthrop of Bristol was not researching a family history. Every man at the bar now also understood that the others understood. The understanding sat among them like a 4th log on the fire. Miss Marple knitted on. It was nearly 10 when Calthrop took his leave. He paid for his drinks and the drinks of others, bid the room a courteous good night, and turned at the door to look back. His eye caught Miss Marple's. She had glanced up at exactly the wrong moment, or possibly exactly the right one. and he gave her a small particular nod. It was not the nod a stranger gives a stranger. It was the nod a man gives a person he has already identified and filed away. Then he was gone, and the door let in a brief breath of the killing cold and shut. Reuben Tovey rose very slowly and crossed to settle his account. As he passed the settle, he paused, and Miss Marple looked up, and the old sexton's eyes met hers with an expression she would think about later that night, lying in Hester's narrow spare bed, and not be able quite to name. "Old graves, ma'am," he said, as though continuing a conversation they had not had, "are best left where they were dug, are they? Mr. Tovey, in a general way." He hesitated a fraction of a second, no more, but she marked it. "In a general way, ma'am, good night to you." He went out. The door admitted the cold a second time, and shut a second time. And Miss Marple, rolling her mauve wool, observed to herself that Mr. Tovey had hesitated, and that Mr. Calthrop had nodded, and that the village of Little Paddock's End contained at least one secret which a January frost had not yet quite preserved. The morning brought no thaw. A fresh frost had laid itself in the night over the older one, the way a second blanket is laid over a sleeping child, and the village green at 9 o'clock was so white and so still that Miss Marple, looking out from Hester's parlour window with a cup of tea in her hands, had the brief impression that the world had been put away in a cupboard until further notice. "We are to call on Captain Vickery this afternoon," Hester said, coming in with a fresh pot. "I sent a note yesterday, before you arrived," he answered at once. "He always does. Captain Vickery, a naval surgeon, retired, lives in the stone cottage by the green, the one with the holly. He has been here, 6 years now. A widower, I believe, or perhaps never married. A very civil man. Albert was fond of him. And you, dear?" Hester paused in the act of pouring. "I have never quite decided," she said. "He is courteous. He is well read. He listens. And yet I come away from his cottage with the feeling that I have given him a great deal more than I received, and I cannot tell you what I gave him." Miss Marple, who had heard many descriptions of many men in her 60-odd years, and had learned to attend particularly to the ones a woman could not quite finish, said only, "I shall be pleased to meet him." They went at 3. The cottage stood across the green at an angle, set back from the lane, behind a low stone wall and a wicket gate, with a single great holly tree, by the door whose berries the frost had turned almost black. As they came up the path, Miss Marple saw, in the lane beyond the wall, a small boy of perhaps 8 in a too large coat, kicking at a frozen rut with the absorbed seriousness of a child engaged in important private work. He looked up as they passed, and then beyond them at the cottage door, and seemed about to come forward, and then to think better of it. Miss Marple noted the small face, pinched with cold, freckled, sharp at the chin, and noted also that the boy had something in his closed mittened hand which he was not, for the moment, prepared to give up. Captain Vickery opened the door himself. He was a tall man, narrowly built, in a green cardigan and grey flannels, with grey hair cut close, and the kind of weathered, equable face that one trusts on sight and is then occasionally surprised by. He bowed slightly to Hester and took Miss Marple's hand for the briefest of correct moments. Mrs. Penrose. And Miss Marple, your cousin, I understand, from St. Mary Mead. You are very welcome. Come in before the cold comes in with you. The parlour was small and very warm. A fire of applewood burned in a grate, kept scrupulously clean. Books lined 2 walls to the ceiling. A worn turkey rug lay before the hearth, and on the mantel, between a brass ship's clock and a small dark bronze of a hare, stood a single photograph in a silver frame. Miss Marple, accepting tea and settling herself in the chair the captain indicated, allowed her eye to travel to it without haste. It was a studio portrait of 2 children, a boy of about 10, dark-haired, serious, his hand resting on the shoulder of a small girl of perhaps 4, who was looking not at the camera, but at her brother with an expression of complete, unguarded trust. The print was old. The sepia had begun to go a little orange at the edges, and the children's clothes belonged to the 70s. Your family, Captain? Hester said, as though for Miss Marple's benefit. A nephew and niece, the captain said easily. Canada now, both of them. The boy went out in '96 and the sister followed. I have not seen either in many years. One keeps the photograph because, well, one keeps photographs. They are very alike, the boy and yourself, Miss Marple observed. He smiled. It has been remarked. The vicary jaw, my mother used to say, comes through everything. And the little girl takes after her mother's people, a Suffolk family. Quite a different cast of face. He turned courteously to Hester. Mrs. Penrose, more tea? You must be perished. I saw you crossing the green, and you put me in mind of a small black bird with very firm opinions about the weather. Hester laughed. A sound Miss Marple had not heard her make. In 3 months of letters, and accepted more tea, and the conversation moved on to the frost, and to the prospects for the rooks, and to a sermon of Mr. Cudlip's, the previous Sunday which the captain had found. He said, promising, in its restraint. He was, as Hester had warned, very good. He listened, he asked. He drew out of Hester 2 small reminiscences of Albert, which Miss Marple had never heard, and which Hester gave with a quiet pleasure that Miss Marple was grateful for, and watched also with care. She herself spoke little, and knitted not at all. One did not knit in another person's parlour at first calling, but she observed that the captain's hands, setting down a cup, were quite steady. She observed that there was no second photograph anywhere in the room, no portrait of a wife, no military group, nothing of a life accumulated. She observed that the books on the lower shelves were medical and naval, and that the upper shelves held, to her mild surprise, a great deal of poetry. She observed that when the ship's clock struck the half-hour, the captain did not glance at it, and she observed, in the moment of taking her leave, that he said, "I no longer practice, of course. But old habits. One keeps a few things in the cabinet. Chloral, mostly, for the nights when sleep is unwilling. A naval surgeon's vice." He said it lightly, in passing, as one mentions a small foolishness. Miss Marple smiled and said she had heard the same of country doctors. The captain bowed them out. At the gate the boy was gone, but caught on the latch, where a mittened hand might have touched it in passing something to a man at a door, was a single very small fibre of dark wool. Miss Marple, who was not yet looking for such things, did not see it. "A lonely man," Hester said, as they walked back across the green in the failing afternoon. "One wonders what he does with his evenings." Miss Marple, who had been about to answer, found that she did not, after all, have an answer ready, and they walked the rest of the way in a companionable and slightly altered silence. It was Lady Constance Aldington who gave the order, and it was given on Sunday morning at 9:30, in the cold blue light of a sky that had not, in 3 weeks, produced a single cloud. She sent her gardener down with a note to the landlord of the Bell, and the landlord sent his potboy round to fetch 2 of the farm men. And by 10 o'clock there were 4 men on the pond, with axes and a long iron bar, breaking a channel through ice that proved, in the event, to be 11 inches thick. "For the children," Lady Constance said, when Mr. Cutlip, the vicar, called at the manor to ask, in his diffident way, what the noise on the green was about. "It is unsafe in its present state. A child will go through it. I have seen it happen once in my life, and I do not propose to see it again. They may skate on what is cleared, under supervision, and the rest will be marked with stakes." Mr. Cutlip, who had not thought of any of this, agreed that it was very wise, and went away. Miss Marple watched from Hester's parlour window. She watched the 4 men in their heavy coats, breath rising from them in steady plumes, working in the methodical rhythm of countrymen who had broken ice on ponds and water butts and cattle troughs all their working lives. She watched the channel widen. She watched the first sheet of ice, perhaps 4 feet square, levered up and slid aside onto the unbroken surface, and she watched, at 23 minutes past 10, the moment at which one of the men, the younger one, with the red scarf, stopped quite suddenly, with his bar raised and called, in a voice that carried clearly across the green, for the landlord. By 11 the green held 30 people. By 9:30 it held the village. The body had been lifted out and laid on a piece of sacking on the bank, and a sheet had been fetched from the Bell, and Dr. Pelling had been sent for, and the police constable from Stowe had been telephoned for, and Mr. Cutlip had returned in his cassock, and was standing with his hands folded, and his lips moving in what was not quite a prayer, and not quite anything else. Miss Marple, with Hester at her elbow, came down the green as a matter of neighbourly duty, and stood at a proper distance. It was the Bristol man. There was no question of it. The long coat she had seen crossing the green at twilight 3 nights before was the coat in which he had been pulled out, and the face above the coat, though altered by what had happened to it, was recognizable. "Oh," Hester said very quietly. "Oh, the poor man." Lady Constance had come down from the manor in a fur, and was standing slightly apart with her niece Iris a pace behind her. The dowager's face gave nothing. Iris's face, Miss Marple noted, gave a great deal. Not grief, for she had not known the man, but a kind of strained and inward attention, as though she were following an argument she could not quite hear. Once she looked up, not at the body, but at the upper windows of the manor behind her, and her expression there was the expression of a woman who had thought, "The house has been waiting for this." Then she looked away. Captain Vickery was in the crowd. Miss Marple located him without seeming to. He stood near the back, by the yew at the church gate, in the same long dark coat he had worn yesterday, hatless in the cold. He was watching the body with an expression of decent, neighbourly, regulated concern. He did not move, and he did not speak. Once, while Dr. Pelling bent over the sacking, the captain's right hand rose to the collar of his coat and adjusted it, very slightly, and was lowered again. Miss Marple, whose own hands at that moment were folded inside her muff, registered the gesture without yet knowing what to do with it. Dr. Pelling worked for some minutes. He was a heavy, careful man of 58, with a grey moustache, trimmed close, and the slow movements of a doctor who had long ago learned that haste comforted no one. When he straightened, he spoke first to the constable, who had by then arrived on a bicycle, and then, in a slightly louder voice, that the front of the crowd could hear, "He did not drown." There was a small movement through the green like wind through standing barley. "He was dead," Pelling went on, "before he entered the water. I would say 12 to 18 hours before, but the cold makes it difficult. There is no water in the lungs that I can determine without proper examination. And there is," he hesitated, choosing his words for the crowd, "a residue in the mouth and on the tongue which I should wish to have analysed. Chloral hydrate, very probably. An old draught. Naval surgeons used to swear by it in my young days." He said it without looking anywhere in particular. He was not, Miss Marple was sure, looking at Captain Vickery. But she was. The captain's face did not change. His coat collar was not adjusted a second time. The body was carried to the vestry on a hurdle. The crowd, finding itself dismissed by no one in particular, began the slow dispersal of villagers who have been given a thing to talk about for a winter. Miss Marple went, with Mr. Cudlip's quiet permission, into the vestry, for she had promised the vicar she would look up a marriage in the registers for him, and she was a woman of her word, and there was no reason at all that she should not keep an appointment because a body had been taken into the room where the books were kept. The registers lay in their tin box on the table. The vicar's marriage was in the volume for 1879, and she found it in 3 minutes. As she closed the book, however, her eye caught, because she had let it catch, on the burial volume which lay beside it, open at the page someone had recently consulted. The entries for the early months of 1908 were before her. Most were complete. One was not. Under a date in mid-February, the columns for name and age and abode had been left blank, and in the marginal note column, in a hand she took to be Reuben Tovey's younger and steadier hand of 23 years before, was written, "T. Infant. Fee paid. By private arrangement." She looked at it for a long moment. Then she closed the volume. Outside, in the freezing churchyard, she saw Inspector Slack arriving at last in a small black car, and she saw him spoken to by the constable, and she saw him nod twice, sharply, and turn and look across the green in the direction of the cottages where the farm men lived. He said something brisk and unpleasant. Miss Marple did not catch the words, but she did not need to. The set of his shoulders as he stamped off through the snow told her clearly enough that Inspector Slack had already, in his own mind, arrested Daniel Sparrow. They came for Dan Sparrow on Monday afternoon, and by Tuesday morning the village had settled the matter in its own mind with the swift, almost relieved efficiency of a community that prefers a solved trouble to an open one. Mrs. Beswick at the post office, weighing a parcel for the schoolmistress, observed that she had said as much from the first. The men at the Bell, over their dinner-time pints, agreed that Dan had always had a turn of temper, and Hester, returning from her morning errands with a string bag and a face Miss Marple had learned to read, set the bag on the kitchen table and said, "They have him in stow." Inspector Slack found a button from his coat on the bank of the pond, and Pamela has sworn to the constable that Dan was with her all of Thursday evening, which any fool could tell is a lie because Pamela was at choir practice till 9 and at her landlady's tea till 10. Pamela being the schoolmistress. Miss Thirsk lodges with the Beswicks. She is engaged to Dan, though they have not said so publicly. Mrs. Beswick disapproves, which is no small part of why they have not. "Ah," said Miss Marple, "I should very much like, dear, to call on Miss Thirsk. Could that be arranged this afternoon?" It was arranged. Pamela Thirsk received them in the Beswicks' front parlour, a chilly upright room kept for funerals and weddings and the visits of clergy, into which Mrs. Beswick had with very little grace shown them, and then withdrawn only so far as the passage, where her shadow on the strip of light beneath the door explained itself without further inquiry. Miss Thirsk was 28 and pretty in a tired way, with brown hair pinned up rather hastily, and eyes that had been crying and were not at the moment, crying only because she had given crying up for the present hour as unhelpful. She sat on the edge of a horsehair chair and turned a handkerchief in her hands and looked at Miss Marple with the wary, defensive courtesy of a young woman who has been told that an older lady wishes to see her and who suspects the older lady of intending kindness. "I won't keep you long, my dear," Miss Marple said, settling herself. "I only wished to ask, and you must say if you would rather I did not, what Dan was actually doing on Thursday evening." Pamela's hands closed on the handkerchief. "He was with me." "No, dear, he was not." There was a small silence. In the passage the shadow under the door did not move. "You see," Miss Marple went on, in the gentle and slightly distracted manner that had unsettled many a witness in her 60 years, "I do quite understand. He was somewhere he should not have been, and the somewhere is something you do not wish the inspector to know about, because it would cost him his place or his cottage, or both, and that would be ruinous for you both. Is that about right?" Pamela said nothing for some seconds. Then she said, very low, "He was on the Aldington side. Poaching. A pheasant or two, 3 at most. He has done it through every hard winter since he was 16, and he has never been caught. And I told him. I begged him." Her voice broke briefly, and she steadied it. "When the constable came, I thought, if I said he was with me, I thought it would be the safer lie. I did not know about the pond. I did not know anyone had died. He came home that night with a cut on his hand from a snare wire, and he was in a temper because he had only got one bird, and he went to sleep, and that was Thursday. And the button, dear. I don't know about the button. He has a coat with brass buttons. He has had it 3 winters. He is forever losing them. He lost one a fortnight ago in the lane, and never found it. He told me. He was annoyed because it was the last of the matching set, and now he must replace them all to keep tidy. Miss Marple considered the handkerchief, and the pinned hair, and the small straight back of the young woman opposite her. "Miss Thirsk," she said, "I think you must go to Inspector Slack and tell him exactly what you have told me. He will not like it, and Mrs. Beswick will not like it, and Dan will be very angry with you for an hour. But Dan in a temper for an hour is better than Dan in the dock for a murder he did not commit. You see that? I see it." Pamela looked up. "But, Miss Marple, will he believe me? When I have lied to him once?" "He may not, dear. But the truth, once it is told, has a way of finding people who can corroborate it. A poacher in a lane is generally seen by another poacher in another lane. And the bird in question is presumably somewhere about the cottage." "In the larder," said Pamela, with the smallest possible smile. "Then we may consider that the bird shall, in due course, be eaten as evidence, and we shall say no more about it. Go this evening. Take Mrs. Penrose with you if you wish." They left Pamela making up her mind. In the passage, Mrs. Beswick had vanished into the shop. Walking back across the green, Hester said, "You believe her, Jane?" "Entirely. She has neither the imagination to invent that, nor the constitution to maintain it. And the button, dear, is the kind of detail one cannot manufacture. A fortnight gone, the last of the set, the small domestic complaint about replacing the others. No woman protecting a guilty man supplies that detail. She supplies the alibi and stops." That evening, after supper, Hester brought down from a high shelf a bundle of newspapers tied with string. "Albert kept them for lighting fires," she said. "I cannot bear to use them, somehow. I shall give them to the church for jumble." She unfolded a Bristol paper from late November and spread it on the kitchen table to flatten the creases, and Miss Marple, drying a cup, glanced across at it without intention, and then with intention. In the small advertisements at the foot of the second page, ringed in pencil by some forgotten reader, was a notice: "Private inquiry agent required for confidential and prolonged engagement. Suffolk and Cotswold familiarity desirable. Discretion absolute. Replies to Box 4111. The pencil ring was faint. The paper was 3 months old. Miss Marple set down the cup and the cloth. "Hester, dear," she said, "did your Albert keep his papers in order?" "Always. Date and place." "Why, Jane?" "Because somebody 3 months ago read this advertisement with a pencil in his hand, and I should rather like to know whose pencil it was." The pencil ring on the Bristol paper was the kind of small mystery that a woman of Miss Marple's habits could afford to set aside for a day. And so she did. The newspapers were tied up again and put back on the shelf. The morning was given to other things, to a visit to the butcher with Hester, to a slow turn round the churchyard, where the snow lay over the older stones in soft, uneven cushions, and to a long sit by the parlour fire with the cardigan and the mauve wool, during which Miss Marple did not appear to a casual observer to be thinking about anything at all. She was thinking about Dr. Pelling. The village, in the last 24 hours, had been generous with information about him. Mrs. Beswick had volunteered, while weighing the parcel, that Dr. Pelling kept chloral in his surgery and was known to dose himself with it on bad nights. The butcher's wife had observed, unprompted, that Dr. Pelling had come to the village in 1912 under a small cloud. His first wife, you know, in London, on the stairs, and the inquest was a queer one. Though no one in Little Paddock's End had ever, in 19 years, troubled him with the knowledge that they knew. And Hester asked at breakfast in the mildest possible way whether the doctor had been on the green at any unusual hour the night before the body was found, had said, "He was at the manor till nearly midnight on Thursday. Lady Constance had one of her neuralgias. Iris told me yesterday at the post office. It was the line through Pelling's case, and Miss Marple knew it and did not yet wish to know it. A man who attends a difficult patient at the manor until midnight is not a man who is dosing a stranger in his cottage and walking him across the green." But she had also, against her usual practice, allowed herself a brief enthusiasm for the doctor as the answer. Chloral in his cabinet, a buried past, a body that had received a draught his profession dispensed, and an enthusiasm of that kind she had learned long ago deserves to be tested rather than discarded. So she went, at 3, to call on Iris Aldington at the manor, on the perfectly genuine pretext of returning a book of village history Hester had borrowed in the autumn. The manor stood at the head of the green, behind iron gates that had not been painted since the war. The drive curved between sweeps of unbroken white. The house itself, grey stone, 3 stories, 12 windows to the front, wore its decline with a kind of starved dignity, curtains drawn in the upper rooms, smoke from only 2 of its chimneys. The great front door opened by a single elderly parlour-maid who took Miss Marple's card with the careful slowness of a woman who had been told that morning that the house could no longer afford her wages past Lady Day. Iris received her in a small morning-room at the back, which was warm. Lady Constance, the maid said, was lying down. Miss Aldington was at her embroidery, and seemed, Miss Marple thought, glad of the interruption. Not gratefully, not effusively, but in the still way of a woman who had been alone with her own thoughts for rather too many consecutive hours. "Mrs. Penrose's book," Miss Marple said. "She was most particular it should come back to you before I left. It is not mine. It was my uncle's." Iris took the volume and set it on a side table without opening it. He had a great many books on the village. He intended, I think, to write a history of it. He did not. Few men do, I find. The intention is the pleasure. Iris glanced up at that with something like a smile. She was, Miss Marple saw now in the better light of the morning-room, not plain at all. She had a good profile and quiet hands, and an intelligence in her eyes that the village's habit of calling her a spinster had taught her to keep to herself. "You will take tea, Miss Marple?" "Thank you. I should like that very much." The tea came. They spoke of the frost, of the body, of the arrest. Miss Marple, in due course, and as though by chance, said Dr. Pelling. He has been very good through it all, I am told. He always is. Hester mentioned he was with your aunt on Thursday. The neuralgia. He came at 8 and stayed until almost 12. He sat with her himself for the last hour. She does not always sleep when he gives her the drops, and he is patient. He is. Iris hesitated, choosing a kind man, whatever else he is. Whatever else, my dear. Iris coloured very faintly. The village makes a meal of him, the old story. I dare say you have heard it. I have heard a version. He has lived with it. It is not my place to defend him, but I should say this. That a man who comes home from a difficult patient at midnight in 20-degree cold, and who pauses on the bridge by the pond because he is tired and wishes to look at the moon, and who later remarks at breakfast that the pond is so deeply frozen it should be cleared before a child goes through, is not a man who has anything to hide about the pond. The clearing was his idea. He suggested it to my aunt at breakfast on Friday. She acted on it on Sunday. Miss Marple set down her cup very gently. On Friday morning, before 9, I was there. He had stayed the night. There is a small room kept for him. He often does when my aunt is unwell, and he came down before breakfast, and said he had thought of it again as he dressed. I see. She did see. A man who has lately placed a body beneath the ice does not, the next morning, request that the ice be broken open. He prays for further frost and for the pond to remain undisturbed until April. Dr. Pelling was not the man. They spoke for another quarter of an hour, of indifferent things, and as Miss Marple rose to go, Iris said, with a quietness that surprised them both, "Miss Marple, the man in the pond, whoever did he do it for something old or something new?" It was not, on the face of it, a reasonable question for an unmarried lady of 39 to ask a visitor she had met twice. Miss Marple looked at her with attention and considered her answer. "Something old, I think, my dear, though the dying was new." Iris nodded once, as if confirming a thing she had already suspected, and saw her to the door herself. Walking back across the green in the failing afternoon, Miss Marple paused at the gate of the manor and looked deliberately across the white expanse of the village to the holly tree by the stone cottage on the far side, where, in the front parlour, a single yellow light had been lit against the dusk. The captain was at home. She walked on slowly, thinking. She did not sleep well. The bed in Hester's small spare room was comfortable enough, and the hot brick at her feet was conscientiously renewed. But Miss Marple's mind, once it had begun the slow arrangement of facts that her mind always began when a case had moved past its first appearance, was not a mind that consented to be still. She lay on her back in the dark and listened to the clock on the landing strike 12, and 1, and 2, and she set the pieces out and turned them. The captain was a naval surgeon. The captain had said, of his own accord, and very lightly, that he kept chloral in his cabinet. The captain had not glanced at his clock when it struck. The captain had a photograph on his mantel of 2 children, whose clothes were of the 70s, and whom he had described as a nephew and a niece in Canada, though the little boy in the picture had the captain's own jaw, and the little girl looked at the boy with a trust that suggested not cousinhood but something nearer. The captain had been in the crowd on the green when the body was lifted out, and his right hand had risen once to his collar. It was a great deal of nothing. A man could keep chloral. A man could fail to glance at a clock. A man could possess a photograph of his own dead self at 10 and call it a nephew without committing any crime against anyone but his own past. Miss Marple knew this. She knew also that she was, at 2:30 on a freezing morning, lying awake because of it, and she had learned over 40 years to attend to what kept her awake. At 8 she rose, ate Hester's porridge, put on her coat and her overshoes and her second hat, and announced that she proposed to walk to the church. The day was bright and bitter. The green, scoured by a new wind out of the north, glittered painfully under a sun that gave no warmth. She did not go directly. She went the long way, by the lower path that ran behind the cottages on the east side, and she came up to the church through the kissing gate at the corner of the churchyard. She had no errand at the church beyond the wish to look once more at the burial register and to sit for a quiet quarter of an hour in a pew and to think. She did both. The register told her nothing further. The marginal note was as it had been. She sat in the third pew on the south side and looked at the east window, which was a poor Victorian one, but received the morning light kindly, and she did not pray exactly, but allowed her mind to rest in the way that her mind rested best, which was in the presence of a quiet old building that did not require anything of her. After a time she rose and went out and began the walk home by the upper path, which would take her past Captain Vickery's cottage. She had not intended to pause there. She had intended only to walk by, but as she came level with the wicket gate, her eye, which was always the eye of a woman who noticed small things on hedges and gateposts in the way other women noticed hats in milliners' windows, caught on the latch. A single thread of wool was caught on it. 3 inches, perhaps 4. The colour was mauve. Miss Marple stopped. She stood at the captain's gate for some seconds without moving. Then she put out her gloved hand and, very carefully, lifted the thread free and held it on her palm. There was no question about the colour. It was the wool from Hester's grandchild's cardigan. The particular pale mauve she had brought from St. Mary Mead in a paper bag. The wool she had been knitting in the bell parlour on Monday evening, and in Hester's parlour on Tuesday morning. The wool she had carried in her bag yesterday when she walked to the manor and back. She had been at this cottage once, on Wednesday afternoon with Hester. She had come up the path to the door. She had not stopped at the gate, and she had not been wearing the cardigan. And the bag with the wool had been over her arm on the side away from the gate, and she would have remembered if it had caught and pulled. She remembered such things. She always had. The thread had not been on the gate on Wednesday. It had come to the gate since. She closed her hand on it and walked on, slowly, down the upper path and across the corner of the green towards Hester's cottage. And as she walked, she traced backwards in her mind the journeys she had made in the last 2 days with the bag. Tuesday morning to the butcher and the churchyard. Tuesday afternoon she had not gone out. Wednesday afternoon to the captain's by the front path. Thursday morning to the green when the body was lifted, and to the vestry. Thursday afternoon she had sat at home. Friday, yesterday, to Miss Thirk's at the Beswick's shop, and back, and then up to the manor by the lane that ran along the east side of the green, and home again the same way. Not once, on any of those journeys, had she passed the captain's gate, at a distance from which a strand of mauve wool could have come away from her bag and lodged itself on the latch. But yesterday at the manor she had drawn the bag out of her muff to find a handkerchief, and she had set the bag on the marble-topped table in the hall, and she had thought, in passing, that the catch was loose. And the morning before that she had set the bag on the bank of the pond, when she paused with Hester to look at the place where the body had been taken up. And again she had thought, I must mend that catch when I am home. A strand of wool, then, somewhere on the ground between the pond and the manor. A strand picked up not by herself, since she had not been to the captain's gate, but by someone whose boot or coat hem or trouser turning had carried it from one of those places to the latch of the cottage on the green. Someone who had walked in the last 2 days from the pond to the captain's gate, or from the manor to the captain's gate, or, very probably, both. Miss Marple let herself into Hester's parlour without removing her hat, and stood at the window and looked out across the green, and did not speak for some minutes. Then she put the thread carefully into the small inner pocket of her bag, and went into the kitchen and asked Hester for a cup of tea. That afternoon she walked once more, quite alone, by the upper path and the lower path and the lane behind the church. And as she passed the church porch on her return, Reuben Tovey was there, sitting on the stone bench in the angle of the south of wall, in his black coat with a muffler about his throat, very still. He coughed when he saw her, a deep wrong cough she did not like. "Mr. Tovey, you should not be out on such a day." "No, ma'am." He looked at her with eyes that were tired in a way the cold did not account for. "Miss Marple, I should be obliged, ma'am, if you would come to my cottage tomorrow, in the morning, if it suits. There is a thing I have carried these 23 years, and I find I cannot carry it into another winter. I shall come, Mr. Tovey. At 10? At 10, ma'am. Thank you." She walked on. At the gate of Hester's cottage she paused and said aloud, to no one but the still and freezing air, "Tomorrow is a great deal to ask of a man of 76. Reuben Tovey's cottage stood at the end of a narrow lane behind the church, the last of a row of 3, with a yew hedge in front and a small slate-roofed wash-house at the side. His daughter Martha, a grey, capable woman in her 50s, who had been widowed in the war and had come back to keep house for her father, opened the door to Miss Marple at 3 minutes past 10. "He has been waiting," Martha said. She did not say it warmly, and she did not say it coldly. She said it as one states a fact about the weather. "He is upstairs. The doctor came at 8 and said he would come again this evening. The doctor said pneumonia, but my father will not have the word. How is he, my dear? He is dying, Miss Marple. He knows it. That is why he has sent for you." The bedroom was at the front, low-ceilinged, with a small fire in a basket grate and a window that looked out across the yew hedge to the back of the church. Reuben Tovey lay propped on 3 pillows in a brass bedstead, in a flannel nightshirt buttoned to the throat, and the cough that had taken him on the church bench the day before had now taken his colour and most of his voice. But his eyes, when Miss Marple sat in the rush-bottom chair beside the bed, were clear, and he had the look of a man who had set his last small piece of business in order and was simply waiting to transact it. "Thank you, ma'am, for coming." "Of course, Mr. Tovey." Martha brought in tea, set it on the washstand, and went out. The door she closed with a particular firmness that was, Miss Marple understood, a daughter's way of saying, "Say what you must, and be quick." Tovey waited until the stairs had ceased to creak. Then he said, "In February of the year 1908, ma'am, I helped to bury a young woman and a child in the manor orchard in unconsecrated ground by night." He paused for breath. Miss Marple did not speak. After a moment he went on. "The young woman's name was Alice. Alice Tarrant. She had been in service at the manor near upon 2 years. She was 20 or thereabouts. A small, slight thing, quiet-spoken, from a Suffolk family, with a brother in the navy whom she wrote to every fortnight, sitting in the servants' hall after supper with the paper on her knee. I knew her to nod to. I knew her no further than that. She was with child." "She was, ma'am. She had been since the spring. The household knew. Mrs. Carmody, who was housekeeper then, and is dead now, knew. Her ladyship knew. Sir Hugh?" Tovey's mouth moved on the name with a small private bitterness. "Sir Hugh, ma'am, knew best of any of them. It was his. It was his. And the labour came on her early. On a night as cold as this, the 11th of February, and the family doctor was not called. He was sent for, but the message was given to a stable boy, who had been told by Mrs. Carmody, on Sir Hugh's instruction, to go the long way and to take his time. The doctor came at last, and the girl was dead, and the child still born beside her an hour before he reached the gates. And you, Mr. Tovey, were sent for after. I was sent for after. Mrs. Carmody fetched me herself at 3 in the morning. She gave me 5 sovereigns wrapped in a piece of paper, and she said the family wished a quiet matter. I was a younger man then, ma'am, with 3 children of my own, and a wife not well, and the 5 sovereigns was a half-year of my sexton's pay. I did not refuse. I have refused myself the comfort of pretending I refused these 23 years. You buried them in the orchard, at the foot of the 3rd tree from the east wall, ma'am. I have walked past that tree every Easter of my life since, and I have not walked past it without speaking in my mind to the girl. I made the entry in the register the next day. I put no name. I put T. Infant. It was a coward's compromise, and I knew it was a coward's compromise. I told myself it was the best I could do. And the village was told she had gone home. That she had gone home to Suffolk in the early hours, having had word of her mother's illness. It was a very thin story, ma'am, and the village swallowed it. Because the village in those days swallowed what the manor served up. There were 2 maids who suspected, and one of them went into service at Cheltenham within the month, with a character from her ladyship and a small sum to start her, and the other married a tenant farmer the same spring with a portion she had not earned. They are both dead also now. There is no one alive who knew, ma'am, but me. And the brother in the Navy was told by telegram by Mrs. Carmody that his sister had died of an influenza on the way home and had been buried at her own people's expense in Suffolk. The telegram was a lie from end to end. He was in Malta, ma'am. He did not come home for some months. I do not know what he found when he did. I have wondered, these many years, what he found and what he did with it. Tovey closed his eyes. The cough took him for a long moment, and Miss Marple held the cup of water for him to drink. When he could speak again, he said very quietly, "That is the thing I have carried, Miss Marple. I give it to you because there is no one else to give it to, and because I think you may have use for it. I do not ask what you will do with it. I ask only that the orchard be remembered in due course by someone. It shall be remembered, Mr. Tovey." "Thank you, ma'am." She sat with him a quarter of an hour longer. He spoke of small village things, of the bell rope that would need new whipping, of a stone in the south wall that had loosened in the frost. Then he slept. Miss Marple went down. Martha was in the kitchen, working pastry on a board, and did not look up. "Thank you, my dear. I shall come again if I may. He will not last the week, Miss Marple." "No, my dear, I do not think he will." She walked home by the upper path. The sun was high and merciless, and gave nothing. She let herself in by Hester's back door. Hester was at her sewing in the parlour, and had set out on a small pea-crust table by the window, where the light was good, the silver-framed photograph from Captain Vickery's mantle. The captain had pressed it on Miss Marple 2 days before, with a courteous insistence she had not then troubled to refuse, so that Hester might see the Tarrant children of whom we were speaking. Miss Marple sat down in front of it. She took it in her hands. The boy was Edmund. The boy had always been Edmund. The boy was the captain at 10. She had understood that in some unspoken portion of her mind. Since Wednesday afternoon, in the cottage parlour, she looked at the girl. She looked at the small, trusting face, and the small hand resting on her brother's knee, and the profile turned not to the camera, but to him. And she thought of the burial register in the vestry, and the marginal note in a younger man's hand, and she thought of a thin story given to a Navy lieutenant in Malta by a telegram, and she thought of 23 years. "Oh," she said aloud, very softly, to the photograph by the parlour fire. "Oh, my dear! Oh, my poor dear!" Miss Marple slept. That night, the deep, undisturbed sleep of a woman whose mind has at last finished a piece of work, and woke at 6 with the answer arranged in her head as neatly as cups on a dresser. She lay for a little in the dark, and went over it once, and then once again, and was satisfied. By 7 she was downstairs, lighting the kitchen fire herself so that Hester might be spared the cold floor. And by 8:30 she had eaten her toast and put on her coat, and was walking in the bright, cruel sunshine towards the post office. She did not go to buy stamps. She went to find the boy. He was where she had hoped he might be, in the lane behind the post office, by the woodpile, breaking the ice in a tin pail with a stick. He looked up at her approach with the wary half-friendliness of a small boy who has been told by his aunt that he is not, this week, to be a nuisance. "Good morning," Morning, ma'am. You are Mrs. Beswick's nephew, I think. Edward, is it? Edwin, ma'am. Ma'am calls me Ned. Ned, then. I wonder if you would help me with a small matter. I shall give you 6pence for the trouble. The stick paused in the pail. 6pence was a sum. Yes, ma'am. A fortnight ago, or a little more, you were playing in the lane by Captain Vickery's cottage. You picked something up out of the snow. A brass button. Do you remember? The boy's face cleared at once into the candid pleasure of a child who has been asked about a thing he is proud of. I do, ma'am. A big one. Off a man's coat, I should say. I thought it was the captain's because it was his lane, and I took it up to his door. And you gave it to him? I did. He thanked me very kindly, and he gave me a humbug. He said he would put it on his desk and find the coat it belonged to. He is a very pleasant gentleman. Was the button new? No, ma'am. It was old. Scratched, like. With a anchor on it, I think, or something like an anchor. I didn't look close. It would not have had an anchor. It would have had nothing on it but the plain, brassy face of a working coat. The boy, 8 years old, had supplied the anchor from his own head because the captain was a navy man, and the lane was the captain's lane, and the brain of an 8-year-old makes such tidy small contributions without knowing it does. Miss Marple, who had been a child once and remembered being one, did not correct him. Thank you, Ned. That is exactly what I needed to know. She gave him the 6pence. He looked at it on his palm with the brief, silent awe of a child for whom 6pence is still a marvel, and then closed his hand on it and ran. Miss Marple walked back across the green at her usual pace, which was unhurried. So, the button on the bank of the pond had passed, a fortnight before the murder, from Dan Sparrow's coat in the lane to Ned Beswick's mitten to Captain Vickery's hand. The captain had kept it. The captain had used it. The most damning piece of evidence against Dan Sparrow had been laid where the constable would find it by a man who had carried it 300 yards across the green and dropped it on the rim of frozen mud at the pond's edge on a night when no honest errand could explain his being there. It was as clean a piece of fitting up as Miss Marple had encountered in a life that had encountered several. She came back into Hester's parlour, took off her hat, and sat down at the small writing desk by the window. She drew towards her a sheet of Hester's morning paper and an envelope, uncapped the ink, and addressed the envelope first, in her clear small hand. The Reverend Stephen Coodlip, the Vicarage, Little Paddock's End. Then she wrote the note. Dear Mr. Cudlip, I am about to do a thing I had rather not do alone, and I shall be grateful if you will join me at Captain Vickery's cottage this evening at 7:15. Please do not arrive before that hour. Please do come precisely at it. I do not propose, I assure you, to embarrass you with any matter that touches your ministry. I propose only to require, at a particular moment, the steadying presence of a clergyman. Bring nothing, and say nothing of this to anyone before you come. Yours sincerely, Jane Marple. She read it through, blotted it, sealed it. She rose, put on her coat again, and walked the 80 yards to the vicarage herself, and pressed the envelope into the hand of the housekeeper, with the instruction that the vicar was to have it at his luncheon, and not before. Then she came home and ate her own luncheon, a little cold mutton and a baked apple, with a composure that Hester, watching across the table, found unnerving and did not ask about. In the afternoon, while Hester napped in the parlour, Miss Marple took out the Bristol newspaper from the bundle under the shelf and looked once more at the pencilled ring round the small advertisement. Replies to Box 4111. Hester had said her Albert kept his papers in date order. Hester had said Albert did not read advertisements. Hester had said the bundle had not been touched since his death in October. So the pencil had been put to the paper before October, in the parlour of the previous vicar, by a hand that had had occasion to be alone in that parlour with the November paper open before it. Captain Vickery, Hester had mentioned in passing on the first evening, had sat with poor Albert through several long afternoons in his last illness. The captain had been very kind. The captain had often been left alone in the parlour, while Hester rested upstairs. The captain had not placed the advertisement. The captain had answered it, by writing in the name of a real Canadian second cousin, to Box 4111, and had then, having engaged Calthrop, returned at his leisure to circle the placed notice in the vicar's paper, perhaps as a tidy man marks the date on a receipt, perhaps from some private satisfaction Miss Marple did not propose to enter into. Either way, the ring on the page had told her last Saturday night what she had not then been ready to see. That the man who had set Calthrop in motion was a man with access to the late vicar's parlour and the leisure of an afternoon there alone. She put the paper back. She wound the cardigan wool round its needles. She sat by the fire and waited for the short January day to dim. At 6 she ate her supper. At 7:10 she put on her coat and her hat and took her bag, in which she had placed the silver-framed photograph wrapped in a clean handkerchief, and her knitting, and a small white envelope sealed with a wafer that she did not show to Hester. At the door she paused and turned back. "Hester, dear, if I am not home by 9, send for Mr. Coodlip at the captain's cottage. Not before 9. Do you understand me, dear?" "I understand you, Jane." "Thank you." She went out into the killing cold, and across the dim white expanse of the green, towards the single yellow light burning in the front parlour of the cottage by the holly tree. He opened the door himself, as he had on Wednesday, in the green cardigan and grey flannels, and if he was surprised to see her at 7:15 on a Saturday evening, he did not show it. He stood back to let her in, took her coat, set her bag on the hall chair where she could reach it, and led her into the parlour where the applewood fire was high, and the lamps were lit, and the ship's clock on the mantel was striking the quarter. "Miss Marple, you will have something. Tea? Or sherry on such a night?" "Tea. Thank you, Captain." He went out. She did not sit in the chair he had indicated. She crossed instead to the mantel, took the photograph from her bag, unwrapped it from its handkerchief, and set it back in its place between the brass clock and the dark bronze of the hair. She did this without haste, as a woman returns a borrowed thing to its proper shelf. Then she sat down in the chair opposite the fire, with her bag at her feet and her hands folded in her lap, and she waited. He came back with the tray and saw the photograph at once, and the smallest possible alteration passed across his face. Not surprise, not anger, but a kind of quiet acknowledgment, like a man at the door of a room he has known would one day be entered. He set the tray on the small table between them. He poured her tea. He poured none for himself. He took up the brandy decanter from the side and gave himself a measure, and sat down in the wing chair on the other side of the fire and crossed his long legs and waited in his turn. "Captain," Miss Marple said, "I have been to see Mr. Tovey." "Ah, he told me about February of 1908, about Alice, about the orchard, about the telegram that was sent to Malta." "Yes," said the captain after a moment. "I have known for some weeks that Mr. Tovey was unwell. I have thought more than once that he might wish to set down what he carried before he went. I am glad it was to you, Miss Marple. He could not have chosen better." "You are very civil, Captain." "I am not being civil. I am being accurate." The fire took an apple log and settled. Outside, the cold pressed against the window like a hand. "You came here," she said, "in 1925. Under another name. You have been waiting. I have been waiting. For the man who let her die. For the man who let her die. Yes, Sir Hugh." He was silent for a long moment, looking into the fire. Then he said, "I did not know it was Sir Hugh, Miss Marple. Not for certain. I suspected Sir Hugh. I suspected the doctor of that time, who is dead these 18 years. I suspected, in one bad period, Mrs. Carmody, who was the housekeeper, and who has also been dead some time. I suspected the gardener who buried her. I suspected, on one black evening in 1914, in a wardroom in Portsmouth, my own self for not having been in England. I could not act, you understand, without knowing. To act without knowing would have been to repeat what was done to her. So I gathered. For 23 years I gathered. And I came here because here was where the gathering would, in the end, finish itself. You engaged Mr. Calthrop. I engaged Mr. Calthrop through a cousin of my mother's in Toronto, who was not consulted but whose name and address served. I instructed him to research a family history. I gave him names and dates. I did not give him my own. And he found you, Sir Hugh. He found me, Sir Hugh." The captain's voice was quite even. His final report was in his notebook on Thursday evening when he came to this room to deliver it. He sat where you are sitting, Miss Marple. He read me the relevant passages. He told me he had also, in a separate sealed envelope at the bell, set down a summary, for his own records, of the parties named. He was a careful man and a methodical one, and I had paid him handsomely for both. And he told me, with the small professional pride of his kind, that the matter was now closed and he proposed to return to Bristol on the Monday. Sir Hugh has been dead 12 years. Sir Hugh has been dead 12 years. The clock on the mantel ticked. The captain looked down into his brandy. I had imagined, Miss Marple, a great many endings to the work of those 23 years. I had imagined a confrontation in a drawing-room. I had imagined an arrest at my own hand, and a public account given in a court of law. I had imagined, in my younger years, worse things. I had not imagined Calthrop's voice in this room reading me the name of a man who had been 12 years past the reach of any reckoning I could devise. I had not imagined sitting here at 9:30 on a Thursday evening with the work of my life completed, and nothing left to do with it. I sat. I poured him a whisky. I poured myself one. I put into his glass, while he was bent over his notes, what I had kept by me for many years against a use I had not, until that moment, been certain I would ever make of it. And then you walked him to the ice-house. I walked him to the ice-house. He was breathing when I left him there. He was not breathing when I returned in the morning. I did with him then what I had thought, in a confused way, would conceal the matter through the thaw, by which time I should have made what arrangements I thought fit for myself. I had not reckoned on her ladyship's order on the Sunday. It was, I think, the only thing I had not reckoned on in 23 years. "The button," Miss Marple said. "The button was a small piece of opportunism for which I am not proud. The boy gave it me. I knew whose it was. I have, by this date, very little to say in my own defence on the matter of Mr. Sparrow, except that I never doubted he would, in the end, be cleared. I should not have left England without seeing to that. You meant to leave. I meant to leave. I had not, until you sat down opposite me this evening, quite decided whether I should leave alive." There was a knock at the front door. The captain looked up, and for the first time in the conversation he smiled, a small, dry smile that was almost amusement. "Your clergyman, I imagine, Miss Marple?" "At 7:15 I asked him to come, Captain. It is now 5 minutes past 8. He has been most punctual. You are a thorough woman. I am a careful one. There is a difference." She rose. He rose also. At the door of the parlour he paused. "You will not, I think, ask me what I propose to do." "I shall not, Captain. I do not think you propose anything. I think you have finished proposing." "That is accurate." He inclined his head, with the small courteous formality of a man who has been, in his time, a navy officer. "Good night, Miss Marple. I am, for what little it is worth at this hour, glad it was you." She let Mr. Cudlip in. She told him only that the captain wished, in the morning, to give a statement to the police, and that until the morning the captain should not be left alone. The vicar, who was a man without a buried life, and was therefore a good man to set at the door of one, asked no questions, and took the chair in the hall. She walked home across the green. The constable came for the captain at 8 the next morning. He made no attempt to leave. In court, 6 months later, he pleaded guilty, refused to disclose his original name or his sister's, and went to his sentence in a silence that the Aldington family, never publicly named, did not disturb. Dan Sparrow was released within the week and emigrated in the autumn with Pamela to New Zealand. Lady Constance Aldington died in her own bed in 1934. Reuben Tovey died on the Tuesday following Miss Marple's visit, and was buried by his successor in the churchyard he had kept for 50 years. The unregistered grave in the orchard was not moved. Miss Marple told no one where it was, and kept the photograph, and did not, in the end, know what to do with it. The train pulled out of the small station on a Wednesday morning, a fortnight after the arrest. The frost had broken at last. The fields beyond the carriage window were a wet and muddy brown, and the rooks were quarrelling again in the elms. Miss Marple settled in her corner with the cardigan on her lap and the mauve wool to hand, and she began with quiet fingers the second sleeve. The long frost had cost a great deal. It had thawed almost everything it had held, but there was a small grave in an orchard that no one now would ever find, and an old man's silence in a prison cell that no one now would ever break. And these two things, Miss Marple thought, watching the wet country go by, the January of 1931 had not, in the end, been able to thaw at all.